And we begin in Bolivia, where a presidential runoff election this Sunday is set to end 2 decades of nearly continuous left-wing governance. That's after the ruling Movement Toward Socialism, or MAS, did not make it to the second round. The vote pits centrist Senator Rodrigo Paz against conservative former President Jorge Quiroga. And the vote comes as Bolivia is facing its worst economic crisis in decades. Eliza Herbert has more.
In Bolivia, the left's governance is coming to an end.
The shift to the right is necessary because the left has had its chance.
On Sunday, Bolivians will choose between 2 right-wing candidates to elect their future president. On the one side is Rodrigo Paz, a 58-year-old senator from the centre-right Christian Democratic Party who came out on top in the first round on the 17th of August. On the other is former right-wing President Jorge Quiroga, who briefly led the country in 2001. The 65-year-old is running under the banner of the Freedom and Democracy Alliance and is the favourite in the polls for the runoff. Top of the agenda for both candidates is addressing the country's economic crisis.
To guarantee that inflation doesn't affect your pocket, to have dollars to restore trust, to end the queues for diesel and gasoline, we have to take immediate action.
We will be a government of peace for everyone. From day one, we will have fuel and tax incentives.
Petrol shortages have become a symbol of the economic turmoil gripping the South American country, with inflation at over 23%. There is a chronic shortage of foreign currency, particularly dollars, and gas revenues, which once helped slash poverty, have collapsed. Bolivia now finds itself parting ways with the Socialist Party, which has dominated politics since Evo Morales, the country's first indigenous president, was first elected in 2006. In a potential bid to woo some of his supporters, Quiroga even wore a traditional poncho at his last rally.
Well, for some insight, we can speak to Angus McNelly, a lecturer in international development at King's College London. Good morning. Thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us.
Good morning.
Now, both of the candidates plan to break with the policies of the former government. So what are the main differences between the two of them?
So the first thing to say is, thankfully, there isn't the same violence that we saw 5 years ago in the 2019 elections. And because politics over the last 5 years happened over the Movement Towards Socialism party, kind of the two candidates are a bit of a surprise, particularly Rodrigo Paz, who came from nowhere in the first round of elections. Both of them are from the right, although the main difference between them is the pace at which they want to implement reforms. So both of them want the private sector to play its role. Both of them want to change the economic model. But Quiroga wants to go to the IMF and have more shock therapy, whereas Paz wants a more kind of gradual program of reforms.
And you said that Paz's getting to the second round was a bit of a surprise. Can you talk more about why that is, why we didn't see it coming, and perhaps why he's so popular?
So I think there's two things to say about this. One is to do with the way in which polling works. Polling in urban poor areas and rural areas is sketchy at best. And so the polls tend to kind of have a distorted picture about who's going to vote for, which is why kind of Quiroga is leading in the exit polls now, but that doesn't necessarily mean that he's going to win the elections today. The other thing to say is to do with the collapse of kind of political forces over the last 5 years. The MAS and Evo Morales, his party, dominated politics basically since 2005. And the collapse of his coalition meant that there has been a scrambling around of other political forces to try and build a kind of social base. And this meant that we didn't really know who was going to come out on top in the first round.
And how would you describe each candidate's base then? Who are the main voters that they each tend to attract?
This is easier to answer for Tutu Quiroga. He comes from Santa Cruz. He, as the previous report mentioned, was president in 2001 after Hugo Banzer died. He was the dictator in the 1970s and has a real strong base in Santa Cruz. So Tutu Quiroga represents regional interests in the east of the country and conservative forces. Rodrigo Paz is the son of Jaime Paz Zamora, who was a kind of liberal who also governed in the late 80s and early 90s. And he has been the kind of inclusive candidate speaking to the, particularly the urban poor. And he represents forces in the popular economy, which is really big and important in Bolivia. But as we will find out today, we don't really know, particularly in the popular economy, particularly amongst kind of urban and rural poor, kind of who is going to win in this kind of massive important swing voter group.
And the former left-wing president Evo Morales was popular with indigenous voters as the first indigenous president in Bolivia. Does it still make sense today to talk about a sort of indigenous vote?
Difficult to say. Evo Morales has his base in the cocoa growers, who are strong in the Chapare, in Cochabamba, the middle of the country. And he really came out of debates in the Sesutsepe, the peasant confederation, in the 1980s and 1990s. So he has a really strong base in those social movements. But social movements are weaker now, partly because of the kind of social disintegration under Evo Morales and the fact that social movements weren't needed as much, which means that they're less important now than they were 20 years ago. And Evo Morales and the MAS are almost a victim of their success, right? There are kind of more kind of middle class people, more people who would kind of associate as middle class primarily rather than indigenous, which means that this kind of the social composition of the indigenous vote has changed.
Both candidates have said that they want to pursue sort of better relations with Washington. Can you talk more about how the new leadership in Bolivia is likely to affect relations, both with Washington but also in the region?
So on Washington, I think that Quiroga is more of a natural ally to Trump. He's very much enamored by Javier Milei's project in Argentina. And wants to go to the IMF and kind of unlock a kind of $12 billion kind of stabilization package. Rodrigo Paz is more of a pragmatist, and I think he would try and warm to the US presidency, but he's not from the same kind of group of political kind of far-right populist leaders that Trump, Milei, and you could put Tutu Quiroga are in.
Could Bolivia become sort of an ally in Donald Trump's war on drug trafficking in the region after this election?
Possibly, but the really interesting thing is that despite the fact that Bolivia is the third biggest producer of cocaine paste, it's not massively important in the production of cocaine and the final product. And part of the reason for that is an irony, because Evo Morales and the 6 federations of the tropics in Cochabamba control land and control production of coca leaves. And so what you get is, because you have these really strong social organizations around coca growers, the cartels don't have the same power in Bolivia as they do in other parts of the region. But what I will say is that we've seen in Ecuador that the cartels are there. They're at kind of every level of the state across Latin America. It's kind of the elephant in the room, as it were. And so it's really difficult to say that kind of the cartels aren't going to be important in Bolivia or can't kind of explode and become a serious kind of social malaise. I think if Quiroga gets into power, he will align with the United States and kind of Donald Trump's war on drugs. But there is a memory among popular classes of the previous war of drugs, which started in the late 80s and early 90s, which brought kind of huge social unrest and actually was the kind of foundations and the context within which Evo Morales came to power as the leader of the coca growers.
All right, Angus McNelly, thank you so much for your analysis today. I'm afraid we'll have to leave it there. But thank you again for joining us. That's Angus McNelly, a lecturer in international development at King's College London.